Okay, okay, great, thank you. Super, exactly what I expected. Great, so I'll tell you today about networks, why they are these cool, super interesting objects and very interesting to model and very interesting to do machine learning with. So just briefly, I have this slide, I'll show it. So I'm associate professor at Stanford in computer science, and my research is around data mining, machine learning with network data, mostly social media and social network data, but recently much more kind of also towards the biological networks and other types of networks. And I have a research group that's kind of a very interesting mix of computer scientists, electrical engineers, mathematicians, statisticians, some people doing NLP, comp bio, all the way to social science. And if you want to learn more, here's the URL. You may want to go visit. And the reason why I'm saying this is because I'm hiring postdocs. If you are interested, come talk to me. Okay, great. So now, why networks, right? Networks, the way you should think about them is that this is really like a general language for describing and modeling complex systems, right? So kind of rather than looking at the world, rather than looking at some domain as like this, what do I mean by that is, I mean, a set of kind of isolated, independent observations. You really think through the network perspective. You really think of this object, these observations that you are getting being connected. And these connections tell you about relationships between these objects. So if now you say that this is your kind of underlying representation, you know, what can you model? What can you represent as network? Or what is a network, right? So if you think you want to model human society and things like that, then we humans interact with each other, right? So if you want to think about what is the structure of humanity, you want to model that as a network. If you want to think about information, how it's spreading, if you want to think about media, creating, again, information and how it's kind of diffusing, again, it's a network-based problem, right? It's about information spreading between the edges of a big network going through. If you think about modeling the economy, right? What is an economy? Economy is just a giant network of different subjects, entities, companies, kind of exchanging resources with each other, right? So if you want to understand or model economy, you should better think of it as a big network and start modeling it mathematically that way. If you think about infrastructure, roads or undergrounds or whatever, again, that's just a giant network. So if you want to think about predicting traffic jams or understanding what happens when a certain subway line will go down, that's ultimately a network problem. And of course, you can go from these big infrastructure type things all the way down to the human cell. And if you say, if you want to start understanding why is life and how life happens and things like that, again, a cell can be modeled as a set of interacting genes, proteins, things like that. And again, you can model these types of systems through networks. And of course, we have this very nice, giant, big network in our heads. And again, it's a network of neurons, right? So if we want to understand these types of complex systems, then a most natural representation for them is to model them as graphs, as networks, right? So the point is that many complex, big, sociological, technological, information, and biological systems can be represented faithfully mathematically as these types of networks of interconnected entities or objects. And that's why networks are cool. Okay, and kind of more, right? Like we all know about social networks because kind of through the online social media and so on, and we all know about the web graph being modeled or the web being modeled as a graph of connected web pages and kind of giving rise to Google. There are many other examples of networks that I just kind of talked to you about, right? So I think why networks are cool is because they are not just this kind of dump of data and there is some objective function and you want to optimize it and, you know, there is a competition about who gets a better F1 score or AUC, but it's really this kind of objects that we are really trying to understand, right? So we are really trying to understand why are these networks the way they are. Actually, this thing is a picture of the internet. So the way different autonomous systems are connected and gives kind of the backbone about how the data flows throughout the internet. So you can start asking questions, why is the internet organized the way it is, right? How would you describe the structure of this network, right? So it's super interesting because it's not kind of just an engineering computational problem, but it's also kind of a scientific problem, right? It's about what can I say about the structure of the internet? What can I say about its robustness? How can I describe it? It looks kind of interesting and mysterious. right? So that's why I think networks are cool. So what this means is that networks or data that can be represented and modeled as graphs is kind of becoming a universal language for describing these types of very different complex systems. Anything from science, nature, technology, and in many other places, we have a common vocabulary that is kind of network-based vocabulary. And this type of vocabulary goes far beyond computer science. In social sciences, in terms of social networks, physics, economics, biology, statistics, and so on. Another thing that kind of gave rise to excitement about thinking of network data is in terms of data availability. We have large-scale networks now available, and also they kind of present interesting computational and modeling challenges. Even, for example, cross-validation is non-trivial because you cannot cut the network in half. You have kind of one observation. And then, of course, there has been a bunch of impact of these things, everything from kind of computer sciencey web startups all the way to social media, drug design, and so on. And just kind of to give you an idea, what I try to show you on this graph is kind of the age versus the size, right? And we have certain types of networks, for example, the metabolic network, that's as old as the life is old, right? So billions of years. The social network is as old as humans are old. And today the social network has, like, of the Earth, right, would have around 5 billion connections, or 6 billion, right? But then if you think about what about in the last 10, less than 100, order of the 10 years, so recently, there has been the emergence of all these kind of networks that we computer scientists, in some sense, helped to create, right? Power grids, okay, engineers, but then if you start thinking about the internet, World Wide Web, social networks, and so on, this is all kind of an effect that we had through building computers and building computer programs. So we need to kind of understand these networks if we want to build better systems. So what I want to do next is show you just a few examples of network-based problems, kind of what would be the applications of what we'll talk about, right? So it will range from very different domains, and kind of the point would be that you can use these underlying principles in the same way kind of to think about the problem, regardless whether you are kind of detecting fraud or recommending content in a online social network, or trying to figure out, what are the knowledge gaps in Wikipedia. I'll show you examples, right? So if you want to detect fraud, then the way to think about it is to think about in this type of bipartite graph of buyers and sellers, and having different weights that are proportional to the amount of transactions that have been done. And this way you can, for example, identify interesting kind of hardwired substructures into this giant graph. An example has been of this being used, for example, on eBay to identify scammers who are scamming users. One thing that I do in my free time is to work at Pinterest and help give good recommendations. The way you can think about Pinterest is it's a giant bipartite graph of these pictures, objects that people categorize into collections. And we have about 2 billion of these guys here, about 1 billion of the collections here, and about 100 billion edges, right? So really then you can start asking, how can I use the structure of this network to make specific targeted recommendations to users of this particular online system, right? Just one example of the application. Another example of application is that if you want to now start to understanding tastes and what ingredients belong together, you can start talking about networks of ingredients, right? What kind of ingredients go well together? And you can start asking, how far away in the network are pepper and onion versus, vanilla extract and celery, right? And you know that vanilla extract and celery kind of don't go together. I would not like to eat that, but maybe pepper and onions I'd like to eat, right? So we can start thinking about what is the taste and what ingredients are we mixing by starting to study these types of networks that are, a bit unusual. These are kind of ingredients that go into the recipes. But thinking of these ingredients as interacting to each other, it kind of reveals about how do we think of what fits together and what doesn't in terms of taste. I mentioned before about, for example, Wikipedia. You can think of it as one giant network of knowledge, of articles. And what is interesting in Wikipedia is if you look this what I'm showing. This is the map of the world, and the reason it's a map of the world because whenever we have an article that talks about a geographic location, we will plot a dot where that geographic location is, right? And if you look at, for example, the articles of across all the Wikipedia languages, this is what you can learn about the world by looking at Wikipedia. You can learn a lot about Europe. You can learn something about kind of parts of Northern America. You know, there's no, you can learn maybe a bit about South America, but you can see other parts of the world that are completely empty, right? There's no articles that would talk about, I don't know, whatever is happening there, right? And that's a problem, right? And this is all Wikipedia. Now, if you go and go a step further and say, let's say you only speak Arabic. If you speak Arabic, this is what you can learn about, okay? So these are now geolocations of the articles that are written in Arabic. And you see basically, you know, it's maybe about, maybe here a little bit about Europe, I guess Iranian Wikipedia, no, but this is, no, actually it's a good question. Saudi Arabia, great, yes, it's here, great, right? So makes sense, maybe a bit about United States, right? So now the question becomes, how could you help these Arabic Wikipedia users to be able to learn this about the world rather than just, you know, a few isolated dots? And again, the question then becomes, where in the Arabic Wikipedia are there knowledge gaps, and how could you build a recommender system that will tell editors to be able to add new knowledge to Wikipedia? One example. Another example, yes. Yes. That's Iran, yes, which shouldn't be because you guys are not speaking Arabic, right? I agree. That's a good point. Okay, I didn't know that. That's why I got confused because it looked like Iran, but then it shouldn't be Iran if it's Arabic. So great, thank you, then it makes sense, okay? So super, I didn't know. Great. Another thing that becomes interesting where networks become very important is, you know, fake news and hoaxes. So we were working on this project where we were trying to say, you see a particular Wikipedia article, is this a fake article or not? It turns out that if you only look at the text, it's very, very hard to guess. But if you look at all these links that the article is kind of making in linking at the rest of the Wikipedia, you can detect what is a fake article or not, what is a hoax, what is a not. And it turns out that this is a particular hoax about some aboriginal god that never really existed. Here's another example about a particular language, completely fabricated. Actually, some people traveled to this island to try to study this language, then to figure out that it doesn't exist. And from the text, you won't know, like it's kind of impossible to figure it out. But from the network structure, you can figure out whether this is true or whether it's kind of fabricated. So kind of continuing the theme of networks. Another interesting thing you can study on networks is these types of diffusion processes, right, on top of networks, right? So you think about basically the network giving you a skeleton for stuff to propagate, okay? So what does propagate? What propagates are viruses, right? So if you want to model the spread of disease, you need to model the underlying network and how the virus spreads through that network. And it turns out what you really have to be careful about is the airline network. That moves people around very, very fast, and that's how things spread today. So one example of a spreading process. Here's another example of a spreading process. This spreading process is a decision to join LinkedIn, right? So we can think of LinkedIn as this virus out of Silicon Valley that infected around 400 million people by today, okay? And it turns out that big majority, like 70% of all the users, joined by somebody else inviting them. So you can start studying this invitation cascade where, you know, this person decided to invite these other people, so, you know, this person joined, they invited a bunch of others, and so on and so forth, right? So you can think of this joining as this big virus spreading throughout the underlying human social network. And you can start asking, how is this crossing countries, how it's spreading throughout the country, how it's kind of colonizing different geographic areas, different industries, things like that. Another kind of funny thing to always look at are these information cascades, memes. Here's a very useful one, right? Like, how do you compute how much pizza you eat, this is how you compute it, right? And this is a small virus on Facebook that infected 27,000 people. And now you can start asking, how do these types of things spread on top of Facebook? And I'll just show you one example where I show you this single post as it spread, and I'm showing you a network of how it was spreading. And here, with color, I'm trying to indicate, it started somewhere here, how it was spreading over time, right? This was early in time, and this was later in time. So this particular thing kind of spread here, and then on this side of the network, spread much slower. If you go even deeper, you actually figure out that this thing is not just one thing that was spreading, but it's multiple copies of the same picture that people independently posted, and it was spreading at the same time. So really, what I showed you before, you should think of it more like this, where different color is a different instance of that same image spreading throughout the net. And of course, you can now start asking, how would you model this type of process? Okay, so this tutorial will be about how do you do machine learning data mining on top of network data. And the applications I'll be talking about will be quite diverse because you can model very diverse systems through this network perspective. So what will I talk about? Here are the things I'll be talking about. I want to cover 4 topics. I want to first very briefly talk to you about how to even compute our graphs. What kind of systems are we developing and using to quickly compute our large graphs? And then what today's lecture will be about, it will be about some very recent work about trying to automatically learn or estimate features of nodes in the network. Basically, in some sense, how do you learn the representation of nodes in the networks so you can then apply kind of classical machine learning on top of it. So what I'll talk about is representation learning on networks. This is what I prepared on my flight. Okay? And then tomorrow I'll talk about how do you detect modules, how do you kind of think about modeling groups of nodes in the networks. And then tomorrow, the 1-hour lecture, it will probably be something about inferring networks from time series data and so on and so forth. But I haven't yet decided. Okay, so first topic, how do I go and compute with networks? What is cool with networks is that you can take many different domains and represent them with the same kind of underlying representation, right? You can start thinking about how do I study actor or movie collaboration networks. You can think about social networks and social or other types of relationships in these networks. You can think of networks of proteins, where each node is a protein and 2 proteins are connected if they physically interact to do something together in the cell. But what is interesting is that all these different networks, at the end to us, are just a network. It's a set of 4 nodes and a set of 4 connections, okay? And this is kind of the simplest case where there is one connection between a pair and these connections are undirected. They don't have an arrow on them, right? But really, there are networks, like you can start thinking of these representations to be more complex. You can start adding directions to the arrows, you can start adding weights and so on, right? So then it really becomes important, if you take a certain type of data, how do you represent it as a network? And there is a lot of choices you can do, right? If you think about the email network, you can think of this as, directed multi-graph means that there is multiple edges between a pair of nodes. And you can also have self-edges. I can send an email to myself as a reminder or something, right? For example, if you think about paper citation networks, scientific articles citing other articles, you can think of this as unweighted network. It is directed because I cite you, but my paper cites yours, but maybe not the other way. And it's acyclic, right? There shouldn't be cycles because you can only cite the papers that have already been published. You cannot cite into the future to create a site. And so on and so forth, right? So you can take a domain and kind of start thinking about how do you represent it as a graph. So now, once you have that idea of a data set to represent it as a graph, there are a few things you have to solve. First is kind of, decide how will I build a graph? What are the nodes? What are the edges? And right, the way I will create this network representation will kind of determine our ability to use networks successfully, right? In some cases, this representation of data to the network is kind of unambiguous and obvious. And in other cases, this representation may not be unique, And in some sense, the way you will create the network, this will kind of determine the nature of the questions you'll be able to answer with your network, right? So usually it's important, like as with any data modeling task, it's important to think about what is that I want to model, how do I take my raw data and represent it in a faithful way to what my questions are going. Okay? Why did I say this? Because it turns out that when you do these types of things, the process of network creation is an important one. And what you need is you need tools that allow you to go very quickly from data to the graph to starting to be able to analyze or run queries operations over that graph. So what we do in my group is we have developed this open source tool we called Snap. Here's the long name that we are giving away under the BSD license. We have an implementation in C++ with a Python kind of front end, so it's easy to use but still scales really well. And you can do hundreds of millions of nodes and billions of edges, no problem. There are many other tools that use much more memory and kind of would clog down your machines, but this one generally doesn't. So then the question is, what kind of machines do we use to manipulate network data? And it turns out that the best way to do this is to have a machine that has lots of memory. And this may seem scary, but it's not. You know, a server with 1 terabyte of RAM and around 80 cores will cost you about $25,000, which I would say is not it's not too much. At Stanford, it's a few months of a PhD student, right? So you have these machines, right? And really, what this means is you can take this data, load it into the network, and start manipulating it very, very efficiently. So any kinds of distributed systems have far too much overhead to really be useful in practice, unless you have a kind of a super specialized problem with a super specialized set of questions, right? So the bottom line, if you want to do large network analytics, get a big machine. But the point is that even in 16 gigabytes of memory, which is what you have on your laptop, you should be able to get in about 1 billion edges, okay? So even with 1 billion edges, you should be able to do that on your laptop. It may take a long time, but somehow you should be able to at least feed the network, okay? So with this, what our library Snap allows us to do, it allows us to take raw data, transform that into a set of relational tables, and then very quickly build networks out of that data. And that becomes important because as I motivated before, many times it's not entirely clear how to create a network. So you want to be able to create it quickly, try it out, and iterate the way you are creating those networks. So the way we do things is that we have this in-memory graph processing engine that has a set of different graph containers, a set of different graph methods. Everything can be kind of put in the disk, loaded into memory, and then you have this kind of high-level programming interface in Python where you are accessing this engine. And what is nice is that, however, whatever is your graph container, whatever is your data representation, any kind of graph method or algorithm that we have is able to run on that particular representation. So what kind of methods do we have? We have around 200 different methods or algorithms that you can run over these networks. In this tutorial, I'm using 2 words. Sometimes I call things networks, sometimes I call them graph. And from our point of view, let's just use them interchangeably. What are the things you want to run on these things? You want to be able to have a set of null models that allow you to create kind of random networks so you can start comparing properties on the real graph versus the synthetic graph. You want to be able to manipulate these networks, add nodes, remove them, extract subgraphs and things like that. And then you want to run algorithms on top of this data. And what I will show you is just kind of a quick set of things you can run on top of networks, right? The first thing is, how do you generate it? You can take it as an input from the real world, and you can use models that allow you to create synthetic graphs. I'll talk about that a bit tomorrow. Though, as I mentioned, those are important when you want to compare whether the network you have is kind of random or not, and then the question is, what does the random network look like and what properties it has? Or you can create your network from an existing network by manipulating, right? And then once you have the networks built, you can start asking interesting questions about it. You can start asking about how about the global connectivity of the network in terms of how many different components does it have and so on. You can start thinking about how would you partition the network into pieces, what edges are missing, and so on and so forth. Okay, but what I wanna basically say is that everything I'll be talking about today is already implemented and ready for you to use as part of this library. And just to show you that basically the performance we get is very close to the state of the art. So here I'm using a graph with a couple of billion of edges and just doing page rank operation, which is kind of standard benchmark. Here I'm showing some popular graph systems and us in terms of number of machines, number of CPUs, and time for per one iteration. And basically what do you see is that, with 4 CPUs, we are much faster than Spark with 100, or GraphX here is with 16, or PowerGraph with 128, and so on and so forth, right? So here, right? So kind of the point is that you can do things on a simple machine very easily, okay? And what I have next is just kind of a set of resources to be able to work with this code base. And it's not just the code base, but it's also a set of different networks that you can download off of our website and play with them. And this is very much used by the network analysis community. So our website gets around 1 million hits last year by people kind of coming, downloading data set, contributing code, and so on. So it's quite active research. Okay, so with kind of this, now I want to go more into the meat. And what I want to talk about is basically the research that has been going on in the last 2, maybe 3 years about automatic feature learning for graph data, for network data. So in some sense, the idea of how do you automatically learn representation for a feature vector for every node in the network. And I want to kind of give you an overview of that new and hot area. Okay. What's kind of the machine learning task we'll be thinking about? We'll be thinking about, let's say, node classification, right? I have a network. Maybe some of the nodes in the network already have colors assigned to them. What I would like to do is I'd like to be able to predict what are the colors of the nodes for which I don't know the color. Okay? So I'd like to be able to apply some learning algorithm that will go and it will automatically color the network for me, right? So what do I get on the input is the network. I get a few nodes labeled, and I'd like to be labeled the rest of the nodes. And the task is how do you kind of learn the pattern of how does the network determine the label of the node. If you look at this example, a simple rule here would be if your degree, which is the number of connections adjacent to the node, is equal to 1, then you are orange, and otherwise you are violet, right? That could be the rule we would want to learn, okay? So how do you go about machine learning? It's, right, usually you take some raw data, you transform it to some structured data, you apply your learning algorithm, and out you get the model. And what is usually the most expensive step is this step, where you say, how do I get from raw data to a set of structured data, vectors, features that I can then feed into my learning algorithm. So what I want to kind of motivate this with is that I don't want to worry about coming up with these features, right? I want to be able to take the network, automatically construct the features for the nodes, so that then I can apply those features to any kind of downstream prediction task, right? So what I don't want to do is I don't want to do feature engineering, right? I want to kind of, the method that will just look at the network and figure out what those features of nodes should be, okay? So the idea will be kind of the following. The idea will be that I want to have efficient task-independent feature learning for machine learning in net. So I want to have a network on the input, and somehow I want to estimate a function, something that will take a node and embed it in a RD, in some d-dimensional space. The way you can think about this is that for every node, I want to figure out a vector, a feature representation for that node. Okay, and I will call this an embedding. I will call it a feature representation for that particular node, right? And the question is, how can I do this automatically? maybe what I should say is one way how you could do this is to take the adjacency matrix of the graph and then somehow factorize it. And that would give you a feature representation, a very kind of bulky global one, maybe not the best one, but that's how you would do it in the old world. Now, with kind of the excitement about deep learning and representation learning, the question becomes, can we use some of the ideas there to be able to do this for networks? Why are networks interesting is that they're actually kind of much harder to work with than other types of data where representation learning have been very successful, right? I would argue, right, kind of images are very easy to work with, right? Images are these fixed size objects. You can resize them so that you get, you know, certain number of pixels versus certain number of pixels. So it's kind of clear what feeds into the neural network, and then you can kind of feed that through and do magic with that, right? So images from representation learning point of view are easy because they're kind of fixed size, right? Text is already harder to do because text is not fixed size, right? Sentences are different sizes, there's vocabulary and things like that. But what is good about text is that text is linear. So you can kind of linearize the text and now start thinking about, you know, one word appearing in the adjacency of the other words to be able to do this kind of representation learning, word-to-vec type of ideas, right? But graphs are more complex. They are neither of these, right? So nodes are arbitrary. Nodes have arbitrary neighbors. Some nodes have many neighbors. Others have few neighbors. It's not clear even what the identity of the node is, right? Usually we give some IDs, some numbers assigned to nodes. But if two nodes have different numbers, it doesn't mean whether they are similar or different or whatever, right? So there is no kind of nice fixed size. There is no linear structure. It's just this kind of mess of nodes and connections. So this will be kind of what we will have to dance around to be able to come up with this feature representation. That's why this is interesting. And I'll come back to these points as we go along. Okay? So what do I want to talk about is two particular classes of methods that allow you to do feature learning on networks. And they are different in the following way. So the first will be kind of this idea of how do I take a network and somehow linearize it? How do I take a network and create a sequence out of it so that I can then start basically building on the methods that have been very successful in the text representation learning and try to build on that part of the literature, right? And the idea will be that, right, for every node, I kind of want to create a sentence so that then I can start reasoning about what is the sentence describing that node. And the way you can create a sentence out of the node is to basically to use some kind of walks, to have some kind of way to create a path through the network, and that will kind of create a sequence when you start at a given. So that's one idea, and I'll talk about two methods there. And then in the second part, I'll talk about graph convolution networks, where the idea will be to kind of think about what people have been doing on the convolutional neural networks, more on the image processing side of things, and see whether we can apply similar ideas to graphs. And I'll tell you also what the challenges are there. Okay? So that's the idea. Yes? That's a great question. So I will show you examples where, of course, you can make this method supervised, and you are kind of inserting knowledge into the network this way. But the first part will be unsupervised. And the way, then, of course, if things are unsupervised, the question becomes, what is a good objective function? And I will show you an example of an objective function that has been quite successful in kind of just empirically on real-world prediction tasks, right? And usually the way you can think of this unsupervised prediction task is almost like you are trying to predict the structure of the data, and you try to kind of learn the features that tell you something about the structure of the underlying. Is good? Good. All right. Let's see what you think after. All right. Good. Anything else? All right. So the first idea. So the first idea, I'll talk about this algorithm that I'll call node-to-vec, because the idea is very similar to what the famous word-to-vec algorithm is doing. And what we will do here is we will use random walk-based unsupervised feature learning in networks. And this is kind of a year-old paper. So all the stuff I'm talking about is very much brand new. Okay? So what would I like to do is I'd like to learn coordinates for every node of the network. The way to say this is I want to find embedding of nodes to d-dimensional space, and I want to kind of preserve some structural similarity between the nodes. Okay? And the idea now is, how do I come up with an objective function that quantifies this, preserved similarity? So what I will say is, I want to learn the embedding in such a way that nearby nodes are embedded close together, right? If kind of two nodes are close in the network, they should have similar feature vectors. Okay? So then the question becomes, given a node U, how do I define what are the nearby nodes around it? So I will define this notion N of U, which is the notion of a neighborhood of a node. Okay? And the idea is that this neighborhood of the node, for now, I will leave kind of very abstract, right? The idea is that for every node, I know its context, I know its neighborhood, but whatever precisely that means. It doesn't just mean immediate neighbors, it just means some kind of what are the other nodes that are in the vicinity of it. Okay? So now for every node, I have the neighborhood. So the way I will proceed is the following. This is a bit dense, but I'll explain. So I will say the following. What I want to do is, for every node of the network, I want to find its embedding F, its feature vector F. And I want to be able to do it in such a way that I say, for given the node and its position, I want to be able to predict who are the nodes that are nearby it, who are the nodes that are in the neighborhood of it. Okay? So this is a set, that's a single node. So to kind of keep deriving this expression, right? I want to maximize this log probability of predicting that these nodes are the neighbors of my given node. I will make this independence assumption where I'll say the probability of a set is simply a product over the members of the set. So now I'm saying, given node U, you want to predict who is its neighbor, who is in the neighborhood of node U. Okay? So now that I have written these guys out, I have to expand it. So how do I expand it? The formulation we decided to choose was to model this probability of a neighbor given the center point simply as a softmax between the embedding of the neighbor and the embedding of the center node, right? Appropriately normalized here. Computing this normalizing constant takes a lot of time because it's linear in the size of the network. What you can do is you can resort to negative sampling to approximate this term, and then things work very fast. Okay? Now that you have this kind of objective function, the way you optimize it, you're optimizing using stochastic gradient descent, okay, or mini-batch stochastic gradient descent. What is maybe important to note here is that right now, basically, all I'm doing is, if you think about what are parameters of my method, parameters of my methods are the coordinates of all the nodes. So I'm really kind of trying to estimate this big matrix where for every node I have its coordinates. And I'm saying, what are the coordinates of all the nodes that maximize this objective function, right? Where I say, given the node, I want to predict who are the nodes in its neighborhood, okay? And in some sense, I have no model. The parameters of my model are directly the coordinates of all the nodes. So the problem with this method will be that it requires lots of computation because I have to estimate coordinates of every single node in the network, just kind of brute force in some sense. Okay? So that's the basic idea. Notice that this is unsupervised because all I'm saying is, given the coordinates of the node, you want to be able to predict who are the nodes in the neighborhood, and the way I'm doing that is I'm basically just taking the dot product of the coordinates or embedding of node 1 and the node in its neighborhood. And for the nodes that are in the same neighborhood, these things should be this dot product should be high, so it means the cosine of the angle should be small. Okay, so that's basically the idea. What I haven't told you yet is how do I define this neighborhood? Okay. So how am I going to do that? So there are many different ways how you can do this. So what I'm trying to show you here is kind of two extreme ways how to define a neighborhood. One way to define a neighborhood, let's say that this is the node U I'm looking at, I could do some kind of breadth first search type of network exploration. And I will say, I will take the immediate neighbors and say, this is my network neighborhood. Another way to create a network neighborhood is to say, I'll do like a depth first search type exploration. So maybe, I do a walk and I say, okay, for node U, here are these three nodes, 4, 5, and 6, compose its neighborhood. Okay? So in the first case, S1, S2, S3 would be my neighborhood, and in the second case, 4, 5, and 6 would be my neighborhood. So I will have some strategy, some sampling procedure that, given the source, will give me a fixed size neighborhood of 5, 6 nodes. And of course, depending on what nodes will I pick, I will get a very different view of how the network looks like around my center node U, right? So if I explore kind of using BFS, I'll get this very kind of local, microscopic, detailed picture about how does the neighborhood of node U look like. If I will use this more kind of walks that go farther away from the node, I will get this more like global view of the network structure. Okay? So what our goal will be is, how do we define a flexible notion of node neighborhood that kind of allows us to interpolate between these two very extreme and very different network exploration strategies, right? That then will give me the neighborhoods, so I can then use the objective function from the previous slide to really optimize. Okay? Just to give you an idea, if I do the breadth first search type exploration around my starting node, then I'll get this kind of very narrow microscopic view, a very detailed view of how the network structure is around a given node. And if I kind of walk further away from the node, if I do something more like depth first search, I get this more macroscopic picture, kind of less detailed, but broader picture of the network structure around the node. So what's the idea? The idea is, how can I kind of smoothly interpolate between these two things? The way you can do this is to develop a simple kind of second order Markov random walk that will allow you to interpolate between these two strategies. And generate the neighborhood. How do you do this? This walk, the way we define it, will have two parameters. We'll have a parameter P and parameter Q. P will be, in some sense, will be the probability that we are returning back to the previous node, in some sense making a step back. And parameter Q will tell us kind of, do we want to steer close to the starting node, or do we want to kind of go away from the starting? Okay? I'll give you the further explanation for these two parameters in a second. So here's the idea. I want to do this kind of second order random walk to explore network neighborhood. So the idea is the following. If I'm here at node U, and let's say I made a node a step to node S4. Now at this node I have to decide where to go. And I have two options, right? With probability proportional to 1 over P, I'll make a step back. And if I ask what are other options, another option is to stay at the same distance away from U as I already am. This would be going to S1, or increasing a distance one step from node U by stepping away from. And I will say that I make this step with probability proportional to 1 over Q. I make this guy with probability proportional to 1, and I go a step back closer towards node U with 1 over P. Okay? So now that I'm here, of course, this plus that has to sum to 1, and then this gives me the probability distribution over what's the step I'm going to do, and I'll flip a coin, and according to this probability distribution, I'll make the next step. Okay? So the idea is basically that I'm a random walk, I'm at certain node in the network, and there's only 3 things that can happen. I can take a step that takes me farther away from the starting node. I can take a step that gets me kind of closer back to where I came from, or I kind of hover at the same distance from the node. So this would be going here. Okay? And then, of course, if I have a low value of P, then I'll be the the breadth first search like, because I'll be likely to go back and then do one more step, and I'll be doing, you know, step forward, step backward, step forward, step backward, and so on. And if I have a low value of Q, this means I will like to keep walking away, right? I will like to keep increasing the distance from where I start, okay? So now this method will have two parameters, P and Q. I can estimate it in some kind of semi-supervised way. I can also do some kind of exploration and do a grid search over them to identify the good parameters. Yes? That you pre-compute. Yes, so you are given a network, right? So you can pre-compute to say what is the starting node, and what's my current location, and then for every other node, for all my neighbors, I can either stay at the same distance from the starting node, or it can lead me one step closer, or it can lead me also kind of a step closer to the starting, right? So I can kind of pre-compute this transition matrix before I even start executing these walks, right? These walks are second order because it's not only that I'm here and now I sample the distribution, but I sample the neighbors based on where I came from. So I need to remember where I came from, so that then I know, do I stay at the same distance, do I go further back, or do I make a step back, right? That's how I do it. So how will now the method work? The method will work is that first I will compute this transition matrix based on what I just told you, and I will compute this random walk transition probabilities, right? Then I will go and simulate R random walks of length L starting from each node U, right? So this means that for every node U, I will have little r different neighborhoods, and each one will be of size L by running this, really simulating the walk. And now that I have this node and the neighborhood, I will optimize the objective function I showed you using, let's say, stochastic gradient descent. And what is nice about this algorithm is that many of these steps can be parallelized, so we can do these things in parallel very fast. Yes?
I just have a question on the previous slide. So say that P is very small, then I'm likely to go back to U. And now what do I do? Because I come from S4, so am I likely to go back to S4? And how is that?
So I start here, I make a step here. If P is small, I will walk back. So then I'm here, so I cannot go closer to you because I'm already there. Okay, so then if I'm here, then what will happen is that the only thing I will have is that all these edges will have weight 1 over Q. So I will basically pick one of them at random, and it will kind of make me I will make a step forward. So I'll be then in this type of position. And then again, I will either be able to make a step back or make a step further out, right? Now that I'm here, I would take any of the edges pointing kind of further out with 1 over Q. But if there would be an edge, let's say pointing here and another node pointing there, I would take that step back with probability 1 over P. Okay?
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Good. Yes.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. Okay. How would you learn these parameters? So the way we've been usually doing this is if you have some downstream prediction task, then you can use you can think of P and Q as some kind of hyperparameters and tune over them. Another thing we were doing is that you can have a few of these parameters, learn embeddings on each of them, and then you can concatenate the embeddings, and then learn the model on the concatenated embedding. Those are kind of the ideas we were using. Yeah, yeah, yes. I'll repeat. Node is just a vector of real numbers. Oh, sorry, yes. How do you represent a node? Node is just a vector of real numbers. Great. So the question is, for every network, for every new graph that I get, do I have to retrain the network? Yes, I have, right? Because why do I have to do that? Is because all I'm doing, right? I'm given my graph, and what I want to figure out is this table where this is the number of nodes and this is the number of coordinates, right? And this is what I have to learn. So now if you add one more node to this graph, I'll have to rerun everything. So this really works well if you have one network that you want to learn the features for, but you cannot generalize across networks, right? Kind of the coordinates are the parameters you are trying to learn. So there is no model. There is just figure out the coordinates, right? So we are saying, what are the coordinates that predict the neighborhoods well? That's all, right? So it's very kind of brute force from that point of view. And all the bias, all the learning is hidden in the structure of the function, of the objective function, and in the definition of this neighborhood, right? But I'm really just kind of learning this matrix of parameters. I'm learning these raw coordinates. And all I have to be able to do is then compute the dot product between coordinates of one guy and coordinates of the other guy, right? And that's all. Yes. How large is D? That's a great question. So in terms of D, usually we think of it maybe as, 100 is a good rule of thumb, depending on the size of the data. But 100 is a good number. All right. Yeah, I don't have a better answer. All right, good. Good. I just want to give you a quick example. I show that. Right, so what I'm trying to show you here, these are two small networks. These are the networks of the characters in some French drama, right? So every guy is a character, and two characters are connected if they meet on the stage, talking to each other. And what I show here is what we did is we took this unlabeled network, figured out the coordinates of the nodes, and then I run k-means clustering on the coordinates of the nodes. And nodes that belong to the same k-means cluster, I color with the same color. What do you see is, for example, for this particular setting of P and Q, this means that I get this kind of macroscopic view of the network, right? Q is large or Q is small, so I tend to walk farther away from my starting node. You see that I basically identify these densely linked clusters of the network, right? I identify modules or whatever, if you want to think of that. Here, when I set different set of parameters where my Q is large and P is smaller, this means my neighborhoods are much more local. What I learn is that, for example, all these blue nodes, they have similar features, even though they are in very different parts of the network. But what you notice is that they act as these bridges or connectors between the red nodes. And you can see that, for example, all these small low-degree nodes, they are all colored yellow, right? And basically, the point is that I will learn different representations depending on how I set my parameters, right? So if I have some notion that I want to find what are the clusters of the network, these are kind of the parameters that work well on this network. And if I want to learn something that's more like what's a structural role, what's the kind of structural position in the network of a node, this would be the parameters that would work well in this network. Okay? I wanted to show that you can run this on networks. This is 10 million nodes. This is 100 million nodes. So it would be this would be 1 billion edges. This would be 100 million edges. And you can do this in this is what, 1,000 seconds, 10,000 seconds. So this is kind of couple of hours, couple of days. Okay. What is interesting is that if you look at networks that are incomplete or that are noisy, which is kind of always the case, you can plot how good are these coordinates for the downstream prediction task. Some prediction task. This is now on protein-protein interaction network, so kind of biological application. And I'm asking how is the performance of classification decreasing as I'm randomly removing edges from the network, or when I'm kind of throwing random edges to the network. And in both these cases, as you go to the right, the network gets more destroyed, either by data missing or by random data random edges being added to the network. And you see that kind of the performance, the features we learned are quite robust to us, let's say, removing half of the edges of the network or doubling the number of edges of the network by adding half of them at random. Okay, I just wanted to show that. So good. So what do I want you to take away from here, right? So I wanted to introduce this idea of feature learning in networks. I wanted to show this idea of how you can kind of you create this explicit locality preserving objective for feature learning, how you can use these types of biased random walks to define this notion of neighborhoods in a very flexible way. I showed you a way how you can then create an objective function and optimize it. There is lots of interesting future work here in terms of designing this type of network exploration strategies, and how could you generalize this to networks that are not just simple connections of nodes and edges, but have more structure to them. I will just say that this method I presented is one of many in this realm of networks that kind of try to explore the network to determine the neighborhood or the context of a given node, and then optimize an objective function. So deep walk, line, and others are examples. They just are basically special cases of the algorithm I present. Yes?
Structures with quite a bit of structure to them in Euclidean spaces. Have you at all considered, say, hyperbolic geometry or Poincare balls as a better continuous space to embed these graphs in?
That's a great question. So there has been work that has considered embedding graphs in hyperbolic spaces, and that is nice because it, in some sense, it allows you to embed nodes in such a way that finding shortest path in the network is the same as kind of doing nearest neighbor hops in this hyperbolic space. So people have tried that. We haven't, in our work, we haven't considered it.
Is there any reason you might prefer Euclidean space to a hyperbolic space for these kinds of embeddings?
I don't have a good answer except maybe computation. We haven't really thought deeply about it. I think that's a great point. Yeah, great. Thank you for the question. Good. So moving on. What I want to do now is take this idea I was talking about, and I want to extend this to hierarchical networks. In particular, I want to extend this to networks where networks are connected into a giant network. Okay, so I want to move this to the case where I have a set of networks, and these networks are somehow hierarchically related with some hierarchy attached to them. Okay, so the way I will think about this is the following: I have this every layer is a separate network, and then I have some hierarchy that encodes parent-child relationships about how these layers are related to each other. I will show you later why do you wanna, what is an application of this. The way you can think about this and why did we develop this is because if you want, like the way you can think about this is that each of these networks is a protein interaction network of an organism. Okay, so or it could be a protein interaction network inside a different tissue in your body. And of course, then either these organisms or these tissues are somehow related to one another. So that's the hierarchy that captures the relationships between these tissues, and every tissue has a separate network. Or you can think about tree of life. You can have network associated with every organism in the tree of life. And here's the tree of life that tells you how these organisms are related to each other. Okay, that's the reason for this type of representation. So what I want to do is talk to you about how would you do feature learning in this type of multi-layer network where you have multiple networks connected with a hierarchy. What do I want to do? The same thing as before. I'm given a set of networks. I'm given a hierarchy that tells me how these networks are related to each other. And what I want to do is I want to embed the nodes of this of each of the networks into some d-dimensional space. One thing that is important in this application is that I assume that each network or all networks have the same set of nodes. Okay, so or about the same set of nodes. It means that the blue node here is also here, is also here, is also there. Of course, in some cases, here maybe I only have 2 orange nodes, but still I can trace the same nodes across multiple layers. So in protein interaction networks, I can have the same protein appear in multiple different organisms. Okay, so that's the idea. So the way we will solve this is we'll solve it by, again, crafting this kind of unsupervised objective function, and there will be 2 parts to it. So one, for every layer, I will have a different objective function, basically the same one as we just talked about in terms of node to vec, and then I'll try to model hierarchical dependency between these different layers. So for the per layer objective function, I'm doing exactly what I was just explaining. For every node in a given layer, I will define its neighborhood. So neighborhood now of a node is layer specific because I'm just exploring in that given layer, and I will use exactly what I showed you before. Given the node, I want to predict its neighborhood in a given layer. This means that for every node and in every layer, I will learn a feature representation, right? So for the node, I have a layer-specific feature representation. So one part of my objective function will be that given that I have T layers, I want to maximize this log probability of node U across all the layers. Okay, and here it is. So this is exactly what I just already explained to you how this works. This is now basically just node to vec individually on each layer. So now the question is, how do I bring in this hierarchy, right? Because I don't want to learn node representations independently across layers, but I want these representations to be informed by the hierarchy I have. So I want to model dependencies between the layers when learning node features. And the way we will do it is the following. We will do the following. We will say, we will also go and learn coordinates of the nodes in the inner nodes of the hierarchy. Okay? And what I will basically say, in some sense, is that the coordinates of the nodes in an inside node of the hierarchy have to be close to the coordinates of the nodes in the children layers of the hierarchy, right? So these are my Fi's, and this is now pi of I means parent of node I. Okay, so I have this very simple regularization where I'm basically saying that I'm kind of learning the average feature vector of a node at the parent as a function of the coordinates of the nodes as a function of the coordinates of that node in the children. Okay, so that's basically the idea. This is what comes from the single layer objectives, and here is that I also want to learn the coordinates in the internal nodes of the hierarchy, and this way share the information when I learn these embeddings. Okay, so the global objective function that I'm trying to maximize has now these 2 parts. It has the part about per layer network objectives. This is, I'm trying to predict the neighborhood of a given node, and this regularization factor where lambda trades off between being able to predict the neighborhoods versus making sure that feature representations between different layers are aligned through these hierarchical dependencies. Okay, and I can basically do the same thing as I was doing before. But the nice thing now is that I have this hierarchy, and I can kind of share the information about these features between the up the hierarchy and kind of down the hierarchy. And the reason why I want to show you this is because the application of this is, I think, super cool, right? So here I'll be talking about protein interaction networks, right? The way to think about this is proteins are these worker molecules in our cells, and they go around and do stuff for us, right? And if you know how proteins go around and what function do they have, this is amazingly important, both kind of in terms of biomedicine, but also in terms of kind of drug development and so on. So what makes things hard is that protein function is usually tissue specific, right? If you have the same protein in your lungs, it will do something different in your lungs than it does in a brain cell. So what we did here is we have more than 100 different tissue specific protein interaction networks in a human, and each of these networks is around 20,000 nodes, 20,000 proteins, and each of them is labeled with one or more of these 584 different tissue-specific cellular functions, right? So, you know, for a given tissue, a cellular function could be that in the renal cortex, this protein is in charge of cortex development. Or, you know, in artery, this is what this protein is in charge of, okay? And we also have the hierarchy. So, for example, if you look at just the brain, here's the hierarchy, and here are parts of the brain. And then, for example, if I look at the brain stem also has different subparts. So here is how the hierarchy is, right? And for each node of this hierarchy, we have a separate 20,000 node big network of proteins interacting with each other, and the proteins are also labeled with those 500 different functions. And here I'm just showing you 9 different tissue-specific PPI networks, but we have 107. So there are other organs, and this hierarchy is much bigger. Now we can go and learn features in an unsupervised way, and the first thing I will do is I will learn the features and kind of project them back to two-dimensional Euclidean space to just see what did we learn. And if you use t-SNE to visualize these features, so I took the networks, I learned the features, and now I did dimensionality reduction to plot everything in two-dimensional coordinates. So every node is a protein, and protein is colored depending from which of the layer, from which network it is from. And what you basically see is that the way we learn the features very nicely corresponds to the anatomy of the brain. This is the brain stem. Here's the brain. And you see that you know, there are certain proteins that have interesting coordinates, but most is kind of nicely separated from the rest. Now that I have these types of coordinates, I can start learning models that will go and try to label proteins in my network. And what turns out is that I get this huge improvement by being able to learn these features and be able to also use the hierarchy and kind of propagate the signal up and down the hierarchy. So we get a 42% improvement over state-of-the-art methods that don't consider this kind of hierarchy and only work with individual networks using this method. And maybe the more interesting thing is that what we can do now, we can start doing transfer learning. What I mean by that is that I can have a tissue that I've never seen. I've never been able to get a hold of that tissue and be able to label protein functions in this tissue. But I can still take the network, embed it, and then take one other network, learn a classifier based on the tissues and the functions, based on the coordinates and the functions of the proteins in that tissue, and then apply it to a brand new tissue that I've never seen before, right? And we can do really well in this type of transfer learning task. We lose a bit in terms of performance, but we are able to characterize networks that we have never seen before, which is very interesting, or tissues that have never been labeled to us. Why we can do this is because we can kind of use this hierarchical regularization that I briefly described. So how am I doing? Okay, good. So this is number 2. Do people have any questions? Yes.
So my question is about if you have missing edges in I guess some of the tissues or time points or whatever you're
Yes, yes.
or some nodes that are only present in some of the graphs.
There is very little I can do about edges. I showed you some experiments where I can kind of empirically show that I can perturb the network and the method won't deteriorate. That's what I can do. Now, if I have nodes that are missing, that's much harder. What I can do, if nodes are shared across networks, then they can inform. Then the same node in two networks, they can kind of inform each other's embedding through this hierarchy. If I have nodes that are only present in one layer, then basically their position will just be optimized with regard to other nodes in that layer, and there won't be any kind of regularization through the hierarchy. That's how.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good. Good. So let me now kind of shift gears and present kind of the second class of methods where we will be talking about supervised feature learning. So here the idea will be that I have some, right? So what I should say before, everything I presented so far, our objective function was unsupervised, right? We only wanted to predict node neighborhoods to determine the coordinates. And once we had the coordinates, then we trained, let's say, logistic regressions or whatever to be able to predict labels. But we never used label information when we were learning the features. Yes? Exactly. So the embedding I was learning so far was unsupervised. All it was trying to optimize for was this notion of being to predict who is in your neighborhood. One more?
Another question is, so in clustering, usually we have the assumption that we want to make communities or clusters. And for example, in spectral clustering, the assumption is that we have clusters that are dense in edges, and the clusters are sparsely connected between them. Is there any assumption here that it's implicit in the kind of, because at the end, well, the first part, your experiments, you're validating the modeling by saying that you are finding clusters, communities. I guess, well, a standard assumption is that they are already like assorted. I don't know if it would still work, for example, for a disassorted setting where you have a big receiver there. And I would follow in the same question. Do we know, for example, if this holds in the stochastic block model, for example, like simplest with this, see what's the like set parameters where this may work?
I think this is a great set of questions. Usually the way people have been approaching this feature learning is that it's kind of model free, both in terms of the model of the underlying network, but it's more about how do you cleverly pass information around the network, and how do you cleverly design the objective function to learn the coordinates. And when I was showing you those two examples, I didn't want to claim that I can do community detection in any great way. I just kind of wanted to show that I can that based how I explore the network, I will learn different embeddings, and that's all. And I think we don't understand particularly well what beyond kind of what I showed. Okay, there is more understanding for this set of methods that I'll talk about now. Okay, so to recap, right? The methods I was talking about so far are unsupervised. There is no, in some sense, there is no model behind them. There is just kind of the training, the training of just directly, the training phase directly estimates the coordinates, and that's it. So these methods basically just directly learn the embeddings. They cannot generalize to unseen nodes. And you know, when new nodes come or if something changes, the entire embedding has to be retrained. And there is many parameters, because the number of parameters that this method has to estimate is the number of nodes times the number of coordinates. And if you think you can, this becomes very hard to do if your graph has 1 billion nodes. All right. And we'd like to run this on 1 billion nodes because we'd like to be able to make recommendations in social networks and so on. Okay. So what would we like to do? We'd like to run on much bigger networks than these 20,000 node kind of biological networks. We'd like to generalize to new networks because networks might be dynamic. We'd like to have a method that kind of builds a model. So in some sense, we'd like to have a training phase where we figure out what's the model of embedding, and then we would want to have kind of a prediction phase where we apply this model to the network to determine the coordinates, right? So I want to kind of almost do what this more classical thing where I have the training phase, and then I have kind of the inference phase, if you want to think that way, right? So the way I will think about this is to say, I want to do inductive feature learning in networks. What this means is that once I have built the model of the coordinates of a node, I can easily generalize to the unseen part of the graph, and I don't need to retrain my model, right? So the idea would be that I could train my embedding model on a graph from, let's say, the model organism A, and then I'm able to generate embeddings on a newly connected data about organism B. And when I say I'm able to generate embeddings, this doesn't mean that I have to kind of retrain the entire thing, but I can just apply it very fast. Okay? So this is what I will try to do. So why is this harder than the previous, what I was talking previously? Because generalizing to unseen parts of the graph requires us kind of to think about how do I align the newly arrived parts of the graph with what I have been having before. And it also brings back this issue we had before that if I think of a neighborhood of a node, there is kind of no canonical ordering, right? So there is no straightforward way to take a node and the neighbors and the nodes around it and kind of order them in some kind of meaningful way. How we were sidestepping this problem before was using random walks, but now I want to kind of present an alternative approach to this idea. And where we will start to build up from, we'll try to build from convolutional neural networks, kind of from image processing, right? Where what do you do with an image? If you have an image, you can think that you have this kind of filter that you are kind of moving around the image and passing then this thing through the network to learn the coordinates or to learn the embedding, right? So the idea is that you have this fixed size window, and then you are passing it across the image. This is one, this is the second one, third one, fourth one, and then for each one of them, you look at it, you know, what are the colors of the pixels, and you throw these pixels through your network. Okay, so what I would like to do is I would like to have this idea of this kind of convolutions over the image, but I don't want to do them over the image. Images are easy because they are lattices, right? I don't want to do that. I want to do them over networks, right? And the other thing I want to do, which we didn't do before, if I have networks where nodes have features or attributes, I would like to use those features and attributes of nodes as well. So the first paper that kind of talked about these graph convolutional networks was last year's ICML. And what the authors did there was the following. Their idea was that given the node, they constructed the neighborhood, and they found basically what is the kind of a subgraph around a given starting node. And now that they had that subgraph, they somehow tried to linearize or come up with some canonical ordering of the nodes so that then those nodes can be passed through the neural network. And the way they did this was the following. They said, let's take the node, let's find the neighborhood of that node. These are the first hop neighborhoods, the neighbors, the second hop neighbors, and then they said, let's come up with some kind of canonical ordering of these nodes at hop 1, at hop 2. Let's now take this some of the neighbors from the first hop neighborhood, some of the neighbors from the second hop neighborhood, and let's use this as the input into our neural network. And of course, some nodes may have many neighbors at hop 1, some may have few. So here what you have to do is also you have to kind of trim down the number of neighbors so that you can kind of fit into this fixed size input that the network requires. Okay? So this is the approach from last year ICML. So what are these guys trying to do here? What is hard is basically given a node, they find this subgraph around it, And then they're trying to come up with some way how to take this neighborhood and linearize it in a consistent way so that they can then feed this through the network. So one way to linearize it would be to say, who are my neighbors? Let's sort them by the decreasing degrees, and take the top 5 with the highest degree and throw that in. What you can think here as an input is some feature vector for every node. Okay, that's basically the idea. What was then kind of the next paper that tried to take these graph convolution networks but change the way they are done is in a semi-supervised learning on graph settings, where the idea is the following. You have the graph, let's call it A. X is a feature vector. It's a matrix of nodes nodes and features. And W0 is some weight matrix that basically takes this feature vector and transforms it, right? And the way you can think about this, maybe the better way to think about it is here, where basically you are saying, let me take my features. Here is the feature vector for every node. So these are my features at time 0 are just features of the node. And then what will I do is I will take these features of the node, I will multiply this with some weight matrix, and then I will multiply this again with the adjacency matrix, and then run this through some activation function, some nonlinearity, and that will give me features at the next time step. Now I can take these features to the beginning, multiply them again with a weight vector, multiply with the adjacency matrix, run through the nonlinearity, and I can kind of iterate these things a couple of times. The way to understand what this is doing, the clever part is that it kind of avoids coming up with node ordering for a given graph. Because if you would write this up out of the matrix notation, what you would learn is that basically says, for a given node, let me find its neighbors, let me take the features of its neighbors and kind of sum them up to come up with my features, right? And then this way you can think of this as kind of propagating these features over the network, where we have this kind of single layer network with weights, and I have some activation function, some nonlinearity. Okay? And what I want to do now is tell you how you can further build on this to start learning features of nodes in networks. The idea here is the following. The idea is that for every node, I will go and I will sample again some nodes in the neighborhood of that node. What I will do then is each of these nodes will have some features associated with it, and I will have some way to aggregate these features back to the starting node, and this will give me a feature description for that node. And I will go and I will iterate this kind of over and over, right? So I will have this way to start with a set of features H0. I will basically here aggregate the features from my neighbors, pass them through the network to get the next set of features. Now that I have the next set of features, I can again kind of recursively aggregate them the same ways, right? So now I have K1s, and I can go to obtain K2s and repeat this process. The way this will work here is now kind of written out. What do I want to do? I say the following. I have a node and I have the neighborhood. So what will I do is I will take the features of the nodes that are in the neighborhood and I will somehow aggregate them. You can think about it. Let's say we average them together or sum them up together, and this will give me the features for that neighborhood. Now that I have features for that neighborhood, I will concatenate them with my own features, pass them through some weight matrix, through the nonlinearity to get my new feature vector. And I will do this for every node in the network. And now, right, I can go back to this step and say again, okay, so now I have these features that are now of order k, before they were k-1. Again, aggregate them over the neighborhood, concatenate them with what I had before, run through the weight matrix and nonlinearity to get k+1. right? And I can basically start learning this feature vector that is getting longer and longer, right? Because I'm concatenating what I had before with what I just got. And with every iteration here, with every iteration of k, I'm kind of aggregating information that's a hop further in the network away from it, right? I'm always kind of summing from my neighbors, but I'm summing whatever they had in the previous iteration. So at the first iteration, I'm taking their features and summing them. In the second iteration, they will have the features that they got from their neighbors, and now I'm taking that. So I'm essentially taking something that was 2 hop away, and I bring it to myself, and so on and so forth. Okay? So these are the three steps. So the algorithm is the following. I start with H0 as the feature vector at every node that you can think of it as something small. And then K is the number of, is what I will call the search depth, is the number of iterations of the algorithm, where at every iteration I go through all the nodes of the network. Yes, right, I initialize with each node to just have its features. Now I do this search depth, I iterate over the nodes of the network, I aggregate the features in my neighborhood. Here is now the features of the neighborhood. Now that I have the features of the neighborhood, I concatenate them with the current representation for the node, and then I pass this through a weight matrix and a nonlinearity to get features of node V of order K, right? And it's here. And then when I would make another step, now K would be increased. And notice here that I'm aggregating features from my neighbors, but from the previous order, from K minus 1. And I keep iterating this. So I'm really kind of gathering information that's farther and farther away from me in the net. What is this algorithm based on? This algorithm is based on this classic idea from, I guess, from graph theory, where the idea is if you have two graphs, you want to figure out whether they are isomorphic, right? Whether the two graphs are the same, they just have the nodes differently labeled. And the algorithm that does that is it's called Weisfelder-Lehmann graph algorithm. And the way it basically is the same thing as I was saying, but the way you start is the following. You assign a random bit vector to every node, and then you have a hash function that says, let me take the neighbors of the, let me take the bit vectors of my neighbors, let me put them together and aggregate them using a hash function to get a new bit vector for myself. And I iterate this K times over the network, and then I say two networks are isomorphic if I can kind of align nodes according to these bit vectors that I have computed. And in practice, there is a large class of different networks where this thing will work really well. So basically, it starts with a bit vector, has a hash function that aggregates these bit vectors from the neighbors, comes up with a new bit vector, concatenates them, and runs for a couple of iterations. And now every node has a long bit vector. So what you can do is now say two graphs are isomorphic if the nodes have, if you can kind of match the nodes according to their bit vectors. Yes? Can you?
How does your method differ from neural fingerprints represented in 2000?
I'm not like, so you mean the way we've seen this thing being done was either it was done in a semi-supervised setting, we are in a fully supervised setting. We've seen similar types of things being done more on like molecules, for classifying molecules. I think that's the paper you are thinking about. They're trying to embed entire graphs. I'm just trying to embed in single nodes.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, that's the difference. Thank you. Okay, so what did I'll be done in 5 minutes. So what didn't I tell you? How do you do this aggregation? The simple way would be to do the sum, but you can do more complicated ways, right? So one way would be just take the average or the sum of the features of the neighbors, element-wise, right? We also did some experiments where you can have an LSTM that aggregates the information, or you can do max pooling. So kind of whatever works for you. Okay. The only important thing is that this aggregation function should be permutation invariant, right? It shouldn't matter whether you sum nodes in one order versus you sum them in a different. Okay. How do you learn the model? What are parameters of the model first? Parameters are these weight matrices WK, and you will have the number of these matrices depends on how many iterations of the algorithm you run, how far do you go. Usually you go 2, maybe 3 hops and not more. And then this aggregation function may have its own parameters. But basically the way you can learn this is you can use the same unsupervised objective function that I showed for node to vec, and then propagate the gradients through to obtain these guys. Or you can have let's say a cross entropy type loss function if you want to be in a supervised set. But this really allows you to learn things really well. And once you have learned these W's, then the inference part is very simple. That's only the code you have to implement. And whenever a new node comes, you simply aggregate the features from its neighbors to create your own neighbors, right? And you can run this on big graphs because it only allows you to do k passes over the node set of the graph. So that's kind of very fast and very scalable. And you can train these W's and these aggregation functions on a subset of the graph or whatever you like. And these things are not that big, right? The dimensionality of this thing is the number of features squared, which is maybe 100 squared, 1,000 squared. It's not billions, right? So that's what is cool. So how does this compare to what I was saying before? So before we were in this node to vec approaches, we were directly learning the coordinates. Now we are not learning the coordinates, but we are learning how to aggregate information from your neighbors. That's the big difference. And this means that now the training phase and kind of the inference phase are separate, right? I train the W parameters first, and now that I have them, I figure out the features of all the nodes in the network, and that's a very cheap operation, right? And then how is this different from graph convolution networks? You can use different notions of aggregating information, and you can use this in an inductive setting where you can either have an unsupervised loss, different neighborhood sampling strategies, and mini batch type of optimization. But basically the idea is that you learn how to aggregate these feature vectors of neighbors into your own representation, and then kind of concatenate these representations to aggregate the knowledge further and further away from the net. And we actually have proofs that tell you that you can actually learn about the structure of the network. What these feature vectors are is you can think of them as some labels of nodes. You can even think that, you know, node degree could be a feature of the node. Some people even suggest just initialize your nodes with kind of random bit vectors and let those be your starting features, and you can learn things. So with this, I'm done. I show you examples of the papers, and there is more papers cited in the slides. I'll make them available after the lecture. Also, all the code and data is available. So with this, I'm done. Sorry, I went a bit over. Thank you.